We are now going to move into our guest speaker zone. Our first guest speaker is David Walker, who's going to be speaking to us about the current state of markets. David is the commissioning editor of Acuity magazine and runs the publishing consultancy Shaw Walker DMS. David has previously edited the award-winning In the Black business publication for CPA Australia, as well as the public accountant for the Institute of Public Accountants. He has also been Chief Operating Officer of online publisher Workday Media, headed Policy and Communications at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, headed Advocacy for the Business Council of Australia, and was part of the executive team at online finance startup eChoice. He has written professionally on economics, business and public policy for many years and worked in the Canberra Press Gallery for News Limited and The Age. It is my privilege to welcome David Walker to the stage.
Thanks, Sue. Can the coffee drinkers at the back hear me? G'day. Sue's all about tying the big picture and the practical. It's one of the things I like about her, so I'm going to try and do a bit of that too. It's terrific to be here in a room full of Sue's friends and clients. More generally, it's terrific to be here now in 2018. We are in a wonderful building in the world's most livable city, in a nation which is ranked number 2 in the world on the UN Human Development Index. We're just behind Norway and pretty much level with Switzerland. This is the club of the people who have the best possible life. There's practically no better place in the world to be than right here, right now. So I've got 3 points to make today. One is the point that I just made in passing. I'll expand a bit on it, which is we are very lucky to be alive in this era. The second is the economic outlook, and I'll summarise that as things will be good for the next few years unless something terribly unexpected happens. My third point is that we're really terrible at forecasting the really terrible things that might happen, and we've just got to accept it. So really I could leave it there, but I'd feel like I was letting Sue down, so I'll say a couple of other things. And besides, I have a mystery graph. By the way, definition of third world problems, when the light from the great big windows is making it hard to read your PowerPoints. You may or may not be able to see most of this, but this is a graph of battle deaths annually in the world by region since the end of the Second World War, the last 60, 70 years. And the thing you can see is this bit right here. Since 2000, we haven't had a year where 20,000 people have died in battle. It's probably the first time that we can say that in 600 years. It's astonishing. This graph still amazes me. Every time I look at it, it amazes me more. So, all those people who say, all I want for Christmas is world peace, don't laugh. They're getting it. So, here's some more good news. This is a graph of 3 measures of extreme absolute poverty all around the world from the World Bank. Extreme absolute poverty at the moment means living on less than $2.70 a day. Over on the far side is 1820. Huge numbers of people lived in absolute poverty. Over on this side is 2002. This incredible decline over the last 30 years means we're actually pushing back global poverty. In less than a quarter of a century between 1990 and 2013, 1.1 billion people rose out of absolute poverty. They escaped from here. Most of those people were in India and China, but a good number of them were in Africa as well. When you hear that the rich are getting richer in today's world, on a global scale, that's absolutely true. But what you don't hear enough is the poor are getting richer. And that's an incredible achievement. Certainly 30 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to find that many people who would have bet on it happening. It's a bit like the end of war. It sort of happened under the radar. Never popped up in a headline. You never read this on the front page of your newspaper. But over the past 30 years, it's just happened. So there's some more good news around if you look for it too. More than 85% of the people in the world can now read and write. 85%. That's up almost 20% since 1990. The global supply of educated people is soaring. When once there was one person in the world who's addressing a particular problem, there are now 10. Think about the maths of that. It means we're going to start solving problems a lot faster. That's going to change the world perhaps more than anything else. You want more good news? I've got it. Infant mortality is dropping. In 1990, 9% of children died in their first 5 years. Quarter century later, that's down to 4%, from 9 to 4 in just over a generation. Global population growth is well past its peak. The global population is going to top out somewhere around 10 billion people later this century, removing one of the biggest sources of political tension and environmental damage. Climate change remains an important threat to the natural world, but solar power is getting cheaper all the time, and it might just get us to a low emissions future. And finally, people systematically, when they're surveyed, underestimate how happy and healthy everybody else is. Some 82% of Australians report being very happy or rather happy. Yet Australians' average guess about their fellow citizens was that only 50% of them felt this way. People in other countries make the same mistake too. It's not an Australian thing. So look around the room. Chances are that 4 in every 5 people you see are actually pretty happy. The reality is that a great many of the planet's people are doing better and better. Like I say, you won't find this on the front page of the newspapers, but it's true. So, let's take a closer look at our economies. 10 years ago next week, the US Federal Reserve announced that it would give Bear Stearns an emergency loan, and the global financial crisis was on in earnest. This year, we can, it seems, truly say that the global financial crisis is now behind us. Economic growth is everywhere. And if those big windows weren't shining on my slide, you'd see it better. But this is a map of the world. Everywhere in blue is experiencing economic growth. And most of the map is blue for the first time in a long time. It's especially strong in the developing nations, that deep blue in China and India. These places are booming. Southeast Asia, Indonesia, with a population of 260 people, growing like the clappers. So let's look at nations like ours. Australia is still in good shape economically. We still haven't had a recession in more than 25 years. It's just astonishing. If you'd asked people in 1992 what were the odds of that, they would have said, given our past experience, probably 1 in 100. And yet here we are. Our unemployment rate has hit a 4-year low of 5.5%, and it seems like it might go lower. This summary from PricewaterhouseCoopers is typical. When all the data is in, 2017 will almost certainly turn out to be the best year the global economy has seen since 2010. Most of the world's major economies are experiencing positive growth, in sharp contrast to the situation just a few years ago. So, bringing it down to a slightly less big picture level, consumers say they're happy. In the US, 58% of respondents late last year described the economy as good. According to the Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Survey in Australia, consumer confidence both about the future and sentiment about the present, they're both above 120. They're both well above the long-term average. Households' sentiments towards current economic conditions are at the highest they've been, again, since 2010. We really have left the GFC behind. So, here's a problem for me. I'm at the halfway point of this little talk and I haven't given you any doom or gloom yet. I'm in danger of being thrown out of the Pundits Union. You're not really supposed to do this. So, naturally, wanting to keep my Pundits Union membership, I cast around for some potential sources of gloom and doom. Where could the next disaster come from, I wondered. Here are a few candidates, none of which you can probably read because the sunlight's too bright. First world problems. So, first one, the Chinese banking system could cave in. That would cause an unprecedented recession in the world's second largest economy. A lot of people are worried about this. A lot of people have been worried about this for 10 or 15 years. And the Business Council, we were worried about this in 2008, that if China went, Australia would go too. Well, it's now 2018 and it still hasn't happened. It's not impossible that it will one day. I'm just saying people have been tipping it for a long while, and the fact that it hasn't happened suggests that they may be missing a piece of the picture. There are other disaster scenarios too. Most Western nations have a real problem with income stagnation for low and medium wage workers. That is some doom and gloom, and that sort of long-term income stagnation typically doesn't lead to good things politically. So we may see things in the next little while crazier than just a bunch of people deciding to elect Donald Trump as their president. And I don't want to downplay any of those disaster scenarios, but and I've got others as well, but I won't bore you. I don't think these are going to happen. Honestly, if the world and Australian economies are going to pull back into slow growth, my guess is the most likely source is rising interest rates, creating some sort of surprise for everybody. This guy here is Nicholas Moore. He's the CEO of Macquarie Group. And he's singling out the rates problem. The quote is, "For most of my working life, interest rates have done nothing but go down." And he's pointing to a pretty good problem. If you're under 40, there's a good chance you cannot remember a sudden and sharp interest rate hike. Look, if you're under 30, there's a decent chance you don't remember any official rate rises at all. The last one came in 2010. That's a while back now. So we have a big population out there who've just never been trained to think about interest rates suddenly going way up. And that can happen. Even in the past 15 years, we've had a couple of times when the RBA pushed rates up by more than 200 basis points in a pretty short space of time. Back when I was young and a couple of you weren't born, we had an incident where the RBA pushed interest rates up to 18%. And yet, I have a problem worrying about this as much as I perhaps ought to. It seems clear to me that if the Reserve Bank pushes rates up and things start looking troublesome, it is willing to push them back down just as fast. It's figured out in the last, well, particularly during the GFC, that if you have a severe economic problem, the best thing to do is react to it dramatically. So honestly, here I am, I'm fresh out of gloom and doom again. It seems to me for the next 2 or 3 years at least, it's more likely that we'll be fine. I mean, it's terrible to say it. I'm supposed to stand up here and talk about unemployment and GDP, and how it's all potentially full of threats and issues, but honestly, most of the time the economy puddles along at 2 to 4% growth, and that looks like that's going to happen again for the next 2 or 3 years. Beyond that, I'm not willing to put a forecast out. Now, here's the thing. I don't want you to go away thinking, oh, that bloke said the economy's going to be fine, and then 2 years later, when the economy takes a dive, you come after me with a gun. I want to close with a reminder, and the reminder is this: never rely on economists to talk about when the economy will turn. It's the turning points that matter. You want to know when things are going to suddenly pick up and you need to invest and hire people, or when things are suddenly going to turn down and you need to pull up the shutters and turn defensive for a while. Here's the bad news. Those turning points, economists are horrible at predicting them. Can people see that? 0 out of 62, the number of recessions accurately predicted by economists in 2008 and 2009. And me telling you this, it's a couple of very bright IMF economists called Heitzer Heer and Prakash Lungani. Of 62 recessions around the world in 2008 and 2009, when the global financial crisis hit, economists predicted not a one of them. They predicted no recessions before the financial crisis hit. They switched to predicting recessions just as things were turning up again. As Lungani puts it, the record of failure to predict recessions is virtually unblemished. So, now the funny thing is, this isn't controversial within economics. Economists know this stuff. They know they're terrible at predicting turning points. I turned on the Senate Estimates Committee last week, and there was John Fraser, head of the Treasury, quietly explaining that the Treasury is terrible at picking turning points. Now, I met John Fraser when I was a young press gallery journalist, and he was a young Treasury official 25 years or so ago, and I'm pretty sure he said the same thing to me then. So when you hear somebody complaining about how economists make lousy predictions, please remember this: economists go around all the time saying they make lousy predictions. It's just that nobody listens. They make predictions and they give the rider, and then people complain and they sigh heavily. The Reserve Bank says this particularly well. It's even done a study into the accuracy of its own forecasts, which I might summarise as, we're not very good at forecasting turning points. This guy, Glenn Stevens, one of my favourite figures in the economic landscape, a dry wit with a sort of philosophical turn, who said not that long ago, we as human beings will be irresistibly drawn to those who claim to be able to forecast the future. So my final lesson today, if I may make so bold, is be optimistic about the future, but don't take too seriously the people who make predictions about it. If a Nobel Prize winner can't get it right, I don't feel an obligation to try. This is Paul Krugman on election night just over a year ago. Markets are plunging. If the question is when markets will recover, a first-pass answer is never. In the next year, of course, markets went through the roof. So I think the immediate future is going to be fine. But please, just don't quote me.